In 2 years, with the labor of 2,000 people, a palace of stone and steel was erected, capable of surviving a millennium. But its creator lived in it for only 4 summers. It all began with a fire that burned his house to the ground. His response was a fortress against chaos itself. He clad the walls in a metal that, in 1895, was more expensive than gold. And while these indestructible walls were being built, he wrote his own son out of his will for daring to marry for love. This house is the most expensive status symbol in history, built on a foundation of a single fear. And today, you will find out why this dynasty's greatest enemy did not come from the outside. He was already sitting at the dinner table, biding his time. We look at this, and we see beauty, grandeur. We see a work of art. Phone screens catch reflections on marble polished to a mirror sheen. Tourists glide through the great hall in reverent silence, their voices swallowed by the 50-foot ceilings. This house breathes an air of eternity, of aristocratic tranquility. It feels as if it has always been here and always will be. But that is a convenient illusion. To understand this palace, you must first forget the sunlight streaming through these windows. You must see the shadows it was built to cast. The shadows of the overcrowded slums of late 19th century New York. The shadows of thousands of workers whose lives were ground up in the millstones of the Industrial Revolution. Because every gram of gilding on these walls, every intricately carved cherub gazing down from the cornices, was paid for with steel, steam, and ruthless will. This house is not just a house, it is a weapon in a war of ambitions, built with the money of a dynasty that half of America considered to be robbers. This is the Breaker's Mansion, a declaration of supremacy, carved in stone by the Vanderbilt family. And at the heart of this story lies a paradox. The man who commissioned this titanic structure, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was, by all accounts, not a warrior. He was the complete opposite of his grandfather, the ruthless Commodore, founder of the dynasty. Deeply religious, a devoted family man, a teetotaler known for his scrupulous, almost obsessive conscientiousness. He saw himself not as a conqueror, but as a custodian of an empire forged in battles he would never have started himself, a custodian of a name that inspired both awe and hatred. So how does a man of quiet faith and personal decency become the architect of such an audacious monument to earthly power? How does the cautious heir to a scandalous fortune create something that will outlive not only himself, but his children, his empire, and the very definition of wealth? This palace was meant to be an indestructible symbol of the dynasty, but he overlooked one thing. Stone remembers longer than blood, and its destiny bows to no one, not even a Vanderbilt. To understand the marble halls of the Breakers, one must descend into the hold, into the grime, soot, and coal dust of the 19th century. Because the story of this wealth begins not with gold, but with water, steam, and a teenager with a single sailboat, bought for $100 borrowed from his mother. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. The world would remember him by a nickname he didn't inherit, but won in river battles: the Commodore. He was not an aristocrat. He became a force of nature. The waters around New York were not transportation routes. They were battlefields, and the Commodore waged a war of annihilation. His main weapon was predatory pricing. He would lower prices until his competitors were drowning in debt, and then he would buy up their sinking companies for pennies. Every cent a passenger saved on his ferry was another nail in a rival's coffin. But the true empire was born from a fever, the California gold rush. While the whole world was looking at the slow, expensive route through Panama, Vanderbilt looked at Nicaragua. It was an insane risk, treacherous rivers, unstable politics, but it was also a stroke of genius. His route was faster, cheaper, and earned him over $1 million a year. He turned the desperate hope of gold prospectors into his own personal mint. It was then that he learned the taste of betrayal. Leaving for Europe, he entrusted the company to partners who immediately tried to steal it from him. They made a mistake many make when dealing with titans. They thought they could outsmart him. Upon his return, the Commodore didn't go to court. He declared war. He established a competing route, slashed prices, and in a single year drove his former partners into bankruptcy. The lesson was learned by all. You cannot steal from the man who writes the rules of the game. And then, at the age of 69, when most people are preparing for death, he began a second life. He saw the future not in water, but in steel. He switched to railroads. He bought them up, consolidated them, strangled his opponents, and built a monopoly that became the very backbone of the American economy. And when he was accused of breaking the law, he uttered the phrase that became the motto of the entire era. What do I care about the law? I have the power, don't I? By the time of his death, his fortune was estimated at $105 million, money that he did not divide, but bequeathed almost entirely to one son to keep the empire intact. This wasn't just money, it was concentrated will, a last will written not in ink, but in the bankruptcies of competitors and the sweat of thousands of nameless workers. Every dollar invested in the foundation of the Breaker's Mansion was won in battle. And it was this inheritance, as heavy as a tombstone, that fell upon his grandson's shoulders. A man who prayed to God but lived on money earned by the law of the jungle. On the night of November 25th, 1892, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, a man whose will moved trains along 10,000 miles of steel track, found himself powerless against a single spark. Fire, primal and untamable, consumed his summer home. The wooden structure, elegant and spacious, burned to the ground. For the newspapers, it was just another high society tragedy. But for Cornelius, it was something more. It was a personal affront, a symbol of the fact that even a fortune of $200 million could turn to ash. The Vanderbilt Dynasty was built on control. Control over markets, over competitors, over politicians. And fire is chaos. That night, Cornelius saw how fragile his empire was in the face of the elements, and his reaction was not grief, but a cold, calculated decision. He wouldn't just rebuild the house. He would answer the challenge. He would build something that fire could not take, something eternal. His choice fell upon Richard Morris Hunt. This wasn't just an architect. He was the master couturier of the American aristocracy, a man who dressed the nation's new money in the clothes of old European legitimacy. Hunt was the first American to graduate from the Parisian École des Beaux-Arts, and he understood better than anyone the language of power expressed in stone. To hire Hunt was to declare, "I am not building a house, I am erecting a monument." And the style they chose was the message itself, an Italian Renaissance palazzo. This was not a tribute to fashion. It was a political act. The 16th century palaces of Genoese and Turinese princes were the headquarters of bankers and merchants who ruled the world through the power of their capital. By choosing this style, Cornelius Vanderbilt was drawing a direct line across centuries and an ocean. He was proclaiming, "We, the Vanderbilts, are the new Medici. We are the American aristocracy, born not of blood, but of the right of might and wealth." This building was a declaration, thrown in the face of the entire world, but especially in the face of one family, the Astors, In those years, Newport was not a resort town. It was a battlefield where America's wealthiest families waged a war for social dominance. Their cottages were fortresses, their balls were battles, and the breakers was to be the decisive blow. It was designed to end all arguments about who stood at the top. It had to be bigger, more expensive, and undeniably more magnificent than anything built before it. This was not a house. It was a coronation that the Vanderbilts threw for themselves. Cornelius intended to erect an indestructible citadel upon the ashes of his own vulnerability. He wanted to prove to the world that the name Vanderbilt was synonymous with eternity. But he failed to consider that the greatest threat to the dynasty would not come from fire or from rivals. It was already maturing at his own dinner table. The beginning was where it all ended, in the smell of damp soot against the backdrop of a black skeleton that was a home just yesterday. The ocean wind, which once broke against its walls, now roamed freely through the charred beams, carrying the story of humiliation throughout the neighborhood. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, these ashes were not just a ruin. They were a wound inflicted on his pride, and he was going to heal it with fire, but this time, the fire of blast furnaces. From this chaos, the blueprints of Richard Morris Hunt were born. The perfectly straight lines, drawn in ink on paper, were the answer to the ragged, unpredictable tongues of flame. This was a plan not of construction, but of retribution, a plan in which there was no room for chance. Cornelius's main order to the architect was short, like a gunshot: minimum wood, maximum stone and steel. This wasn't a question of aesthetics. It was an obsession. He was going to build America's first truly fireproof mansion, a house that would not just stand, but withstand. And the construction began with the banishment of the past. The foundation tore into the earth with unprecedented fury. Tens of thousands of tons of soil were removed to make way for a base capable of supporting the weight of an entire European palace. This foundation had to bear more than just the weight of stone. It had to bear the weight of the Vanderbilt name. Then, the skeleton of a titan began to rise from the ground, not of wood, which remembers life and fears fire, but of thousands of tons of steel beams. It was the backbone of the industrial age, hidden beneath the future marble skin of an ancient palazzo. The steel that held up the bridges and carried the trains of his empire now became the framework of his home. The technology that brought him money was now supposed to buy him immortality. This was more than construction. It was an act of exorcism. Every steel pile driven into the ground, every block of granite set in place, was an incantation against the demon of fire. Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man of faith, used the most advanced technologies of his time to perform a ritual. He was banishing the very memory of vulnerability from this land. He was building a fortress to protect himself from the ghost of fire. But as he erected the walls, he failed to see that the most dangerous demons do not come with the wind. They are born in the silence of gilded rooms. A new city arose above the cliffs of Newport, temporary, noisy, built of scaffolding and ambition. Every day at sunrise, 2,000 people flocked here. This was an army assembled for the construction of a single citadel, the legions of the Titan. Who were these men? Their names are not carved on the marble walls, but it was their hands that built this palace. They were Italian stonemasons, whose fathers and grandfathers had built churches in Tuscany. They came here with a hammer and chisel and spoke to the stone in the same language. They were Irish laborers, fleeing famine, whose strength tore into the earth and lifted steel beams to the sky. They were French carvers, whose fingers could make oak bloom with acanthus leaves. a whole Babylon of accents and fates, united by one goal: to build a palace for an American king who was himself the grandson of a poor Dutch farmer. And all this took place against the backdrop of a national disaster. In 1893, America was hit by one of the worst economic depressions in its history. Banks collapsed, factories closed, thousands of people stood in bread lines. Violent strikes erupted across the country as workers demanded some measure of mercy from the industrialists. And in Newport, Cornelius Vanderbilt paid. He paid his workers the highest wages on the coast. The newspapers might have called it generosity, but it was a cold, flawless calculation. Vanderbilt wasn't buying labor. He was buying time. He was buying loyalty. He was buying silence. Every extra coin in a mason's pocket was insurance against a strike that could have halted his race against time. He knew the price of labor, but he knew even better that the price of silence and uninterrupted work was far higher. Every hammer blow on this construction site was a double strike. One blow shaped the stone. The other struck at the very idea of a workers' revolt. The palace grew in the silence of purchased tranquility. This harmony was paid for with money that the very system, which had created hunger on the streets of Philadelphia, was pouring into the pockets of the builders of this temple of inequality. Cornelius Vanderbilt was building his indestructible home, and he could not allow its foundation to be undermined by hunger riots. He simply paid for the world outside his construction site to cease to exist. The construction in Newport was only the visible part of a gigantic mechanism. The real battle was not fought on land, but at sea. The world map on the table in Cornelius Vanderbilt's office came to life, transforming into the field of a global logistical operation. Every stone in the walls of the breakers wasn't just bought, it was conquered and delivered. Ships laden with marble slowly crossed the Atlantic, defying the storms. Their holds were filled with treasures torn from the very bowels of the earth. Stone from the quarries of Italy, the same kind from which Michelangelo carved his prophets, now sailed to America to become the facade for a railroad tycoon. Rare Numidian marble, with its blood red and gold veins, quarried in Africa, was transported to become the columns in the dining room. Rome sent alabaster, fragile and translucent as frozen light, destined for the fireplaces. And in France, in Parisian workshops, the finest wood and metal carvers worked on panels for the music room and library. They created entire rooms, numbered every detail, then carefully disassembled them, packed them into crates, and sent them to the port. These crates were time capsules, preserving centuries of European craftsmanship. And when these ships arrived in American ports, the main force of the Vanderbilts came into play. Their railroad empire, the steel arteries that pumped coal, grain, and livestock across the country, now worked for one flagship project. Special temporary branch lines were laid, leading directly to the construction site. Trains loaded with African marble and French panels arrived at the very foot of the growing palace. It was an unprecedented demonstration of power. The Vanderbilts didn't just buy materials from all over the world. They used their own private transportation system to deliver them. The world had become their personal warehouse. Continents became their suppliers, oceans, their transport corridors, and their railroads, the arteries feeding the heart of their growing ambitions. Every whistle of a train arriving in Newport was a salute to their global might. They weren't just building a house. They were assembling it from pieces of the planet, proving that for the capital of the Vanderbilts, neither borders nor distances existed. Beneath the skin of African marble and Italian limestone hid a skeleton that told the truth about this house. Thousands of tons of steel beams, joined by rivets, formed a frame, invisible and indestructible, It was the engineering poetry of its time, a declaration of technology's superiority over tradition. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was building his palace, but he thought like a railroad tycoon. Strength and safety had to be the foundation of everything. But his greatest fear was not of an external enemy, but an internal one, of the very force he sought to command. Steam, fire, trapped in a boiler. The memory of the fire had turned into a panicked obsession. A boiler explosion in the basement was as much a nightmare to him as a stray spark on the roof. And so his engineers made a decision that their contemporaries would have considered madness. They decided to build the boiler room, the heart of the entire heating system. The giant boilers that devoured tons of coal to heat 70 rooms, not in the house, not even next to it. It was built underground, beneath the street, outside the main gates. Workers dug a huge subterranean cavern, reinforced it with brick and steel, and placed the roaring, fiery monsters inside. From this underground fortress, a tunnel was run to the mansion, a long brick corridor through which pipes ran, carrying heat and hot water into the house. It was a technological umbilical cord, connecting the palace to its dangerous, fiery heart. This tunnel is a metaphor for the entire project. It was an attempt to take the very nature of the elements under absolute, total control. Fire, water, steam, all the most dangerous forces were isolated, driven into underground cages of steel and brick, and allowed into the house only in a tamed, safe form. Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man whose family had tamed an entire country with steel rails, now tried to apply the same principle to his home. He wanted to create a perfect system where there was no room for chaos, no room for chance. He was building a machine for living, in which even the heat arrived on schedule and by strict command from underground. But he forgot that the most untamable fire is the fire of human passions, and it cannot be locked away in a boiler room. While Italian stonecutters were cladding the walls of the breaker's mansion in marble, symbolizing indestructibility, the Vanderbilt Dynasty itself began to crack. The blow didn't come from Wall Street competitors, nor from enraged workers. It came from within, from the heart of the family. Cornelius II's son and namesake, Cornelius III, known to the family as Neely, did the unthinkable. He fell in love. His chosen one was Grace Wilson, the daughter of a New York banker. By any measure, it was a brilliant match. But not by Vanderbilt standards. The Wilson family was respectable, but their wealth was recent, and their lineage not distinguished enough. For Cornelius II, who was building a palace to rival those of kings, such a marriage was a mesalliance, an insult to the dynastic strategy. Marriages in this world were not unions of hearts. They were mergers of capital, the strengthening of alliances. Every child was an asset to be invested for the maximum benefit of the clan, and Neely had dared to choose a wife for love. The father issued an ultimatum. The son chose love. The scandal erupted with the fury of a hurricane. While the walls of the palace, this monument to family unity and power, grew day by day, the family itself was fracturing before the eyes of all New York society. The newspapers savored the details. Father and son stopped speaking. The house, being built as a stage to display the clan's power, became a witness to its internal collapse. Cornelius II was a man of iron will. He saw not romance in his son's actions, but betrayal. A betrayal of duty, of the family name, of everything he sought to preserve and immortalize. And his revenge was cold and legally impeccable. He summoned his lawyers and changed his will. He struck his firstborn from the list of heirs to the multi-million-dollar empire. From a fortune estimated at $70 million, he left Neely only $1 million from his grandfather's trust fund. Pathetic crumbs, a public humiliation. This act laid bare the philosophy of the man who commissioned the breakers. Nothing, not even a father's love, was to stand in the way of preserving the dynasty's permanence. To him, the family was a corporation, and he was its chairman of the board. And he fired his own son without hesitation. He was completing his perfect home, his fortress. But he failed to consider that the strongest walls cannot protect from the emptiness that settles within when you sacrifice your children to stone idols. Once the exterior walls were erected, the magic began. The interior decoration of the house was entrusted to the Parisian decorator Jules Allard, a man who thought not in terms of rooms, but of works of art. The breakers was transformed into a jewelry box, where each room was a separate, shining treasure. The library, with its walnut panels and a ceiling covered in gold leaf, resembled the chambers of a cardinal. The great dining room was an almost exact replica of the Salon of Hercules at Versailles, directly borrowing the splendor of French kings. But the true, most audacious statement of status was not made in these grand halls. It was hidden in a relatively small room, intended for the lady of the house's morning tea. The morning room. The eye is drawn to 4 platinum medallions on the ceiling, depicting ancient goddesses. It appears to be just a silvery metal, an elegant decoration. But herein lies the key to understanding the Vanderbilt mindset. It is not silver, nor is it white gold, it is platinum. In the 1890s, platinum, this rare, refractory, and difficult-to-work metal, was more expensive than gold, significantly more expensive. To use it for ceiling decor was not just a luxury, it was unheard of. It was the most overt, most expensive, and most unambiguous way of saying, we can afford what you dare not even dream of. Gold was the currency of kings, but platinum was the currency of the titans of industry. It was the metal of the New Age, a symbol of scientific progress and boundless wealth. To adorn a room with platinum was to inscribe one's financial supremacy directly into the walls of the house. Every time Alice Vanderbilt drank her morning tea here, the sun's rays would reflect off a metal that was worth more than the annual income of an average American city. And everywhere, like a recurring motif, the same symbol was repeated. The acorn, the Vanderbilt family emblem, a reference to the Dutch proverb, "From a small acorn, a mighty oak grows." It was carved into wood, cast in bronze, woven into the patterns on the walls. It was the owner's mark, stamped on every inch of this palace. The acorn reminded all who entered these doors, you are on Vanderbilt territory. Every object, every glint of light, belonged to them. The house was not merely their property, it was an extension of their dynasty, their will, their ego, imprinted on stone, wood, and the most expensive metal on earth. Behind the gleaming facade of platinum and marble, there existed a second house, invisible, quiet, but vital. It was the world of 40 people, without whom this palace would be but a lifeless museum. This was the servants' domain. The architect, Richard Morris Hunt, designed the breakers as 2 separate, almost non-intersecting worlds, one for show, the other for function. While guests marveled at the vastness of the great hall, behind thick walls, in a labyrinth of narrow corridors and secret staircases, an invisible army moved. Their world was designed with the same cold logic as the boiler room underground. It was subordinated to a single goal, to ensure the flawless lives of the masters while remaining utterly invisible. The kitchens, the size of a restaurant's, were located in the basement. From there, dishes were sent up on special dumbwaiters to arrive at the table hot, as if appearing from nowhere. The laundries, with their gigantic boilers and presses, worked around the clock to ensure the snow-white tablecloths and starched collars were always perfect. A private power plant hummed in the distance, feeding the first electric lights. An internal telephone system connected the rooms, allowing orders to be given silently, without raising a voice. The house was not just a building, it was a living organism, a complex machine, and the servants were its circulatory system. Maids, footmen, cooks, laundresses, grooms. They were the blood cells that carried life through these gilded veins, but they themselves remained hidden beneath the skin. This system was brought to perfection. The servants' corridors were designed so that none of them crossed the formal halls. The staircases were narrow and steep, hidden within the thickness of the walls. Their rooms on the upper floors were small and ascetic. They lived above the paradise they serviced, but were never a part of it. They knew all the secrets of this house. They heard all the arguments, muffled by heavy drapes. They saw the tears that were wiped away with silk handkerchiefs. They were the silent witnesses to a life that, from the outside, seemed like a fairy tale. Their invisibility was the main condition of their contract. They were part of the mechanism, but not part of the family. They were the hands that upheld the illusion of ease and grandeur, but they themselves remained in the shadows. And in these shadows, their own stories, their own dramas, and their own grievances were born. Stories the marble walls will never tell. Construction was nearing its end. In the very heart of the house, at its conceptual center, workers were removing the last of the scaffolding. And the great hall was revealed, a space designed to overwhelm. A 50-foot ceiling painted with skies, columns of African marble, a grand staircase so wide a carriage could pass upon it. This was not merely a vestibule. It was the piazza of an Italian city, brought indoors and intended for one man and his family. When you stand here, below, and look up, you physically feel your own insignificance. And that was precisely the intention. The Great Hall was an architectural instrument of suppression. It was meant to instantly explain to every guest, every petitioner, every competitor who was master here. But while this man-made sky was being born inside the palace, outside, on the pages of newspapers and magazines, storm clouds were gathering. For millions of Americans trying to survive a brutal economic depression, the Vanderbilt name was not a symbol of success. It was a synonym for greed. Cartoonists depicted family members as giant octopuses with locomotive heads, their tentacles sucking money from farmers, workers, and small businessmen. They were drawn as kings bloated with gold, sitting on thrones made of the skulls of ruined competitors. The construction of the breakers, widely covered in the press, became the prime exhibit in this public indictment. This house ceased to be merely a private residence. It became a symbol of the chasm that had opened between a handful of the ultra-rich and the rest of the nation. Every news report about a shipment of rare marble, every piece of gossip about the cost of the platinum finish, was a slap in the face to those who could not afford to buy food. The Great Hall was designed to inspire admiration, but it provoked hatred. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was building a fortress to protect himself from fire and time, but he had unwittingly erected the most conspicuous target in the country for anger and contempt. He wanted his house to speak of greatness, and it spoke, but in a language that everyone understood, the language of defiant, limitless wealth, utterly indifferent to the suffering of others. The Breakers was ready to become the grandest stage of the Gilded Age and its most resounding curse. 2 years, just 2 years. From the first stone laid on the ashes to the final brushstroke of paint on the ceiling of the Great Hall. In an era when construction was powered by muscle and horses, This wasn't just speed. It was a defiance of the laws of physics. 2,000 workers, toiling day and night. Ships crossing the ocean without delay. Trains delivering materials with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. The whole world watched this as a triumph of American efficiency and unlimited financial possibilities. But behind this demonstration of power hid another, far more personal and desperate reason. This incredible speed was dictated not only by ambition, it was dictated by fear. 10 years before construction began, at the height of his power, Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered a massive stroke. The stroke left him partially paralyzed and permanently damaged his health. The man who controlled the most powerful transportation empire in the world now struggled to control his own body. That is precisely why he was in such a hurry. Every day of construction was a day won from his illness. Every block of marble set in place was a small victory over his own fragility. This wasn't just a construction project. It was a race against death. He had to make it in time, to see his masterpiece completed, to prove to the world, and above all to himself, that his will was stronger than the frailty of his flesh. He wasn't just investing money into this project. He was investing the last of his life force. He was directing the construction project of the century, already a terminally ill man, desperately trying to leave behind something indestructible, something that neither fire, nor time, nor death itself could take away. And he won. In the summer of 1895, the Vanderbilt family moved into their new palace. The race was over. The triumph was complete. He stood in the middle of the great hall, surrounded by the splendor he had created. He had won. But the price of this victory was high. He had built a monument to eternity, but he himself had very little time left to enjoy it, and the palace came to life. In the summer of 1895, the Breakers' mansion threw open its doors, and the light of the Gilded Age flooded its halls. The most brilliant event, the apotheosis of this short-lived triumph, was the coming-of-age ball for their daughter, Gertrude. 400 guests, the greatest names in America, the Astors, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, an ocean of champagne and a glitter of diamonds that could rival the stars over the Atlantic. For one night, this house became what it was always meant to be, a stage for the demonstration of absolute success. But behind the dazzling facade of the celebration, another reality was hidden. For the children of Cornelius Vanderbilt, this palace was not a home, but a gilded cage, a perfect stage to display greatness, but a toxic environment for raising free and happy individuals. Every step they took was regulated. Every acquaintance approved. Their future was mapped out, just like the routes of their father's trains. And they began to rebel, each in their own way. Gertrude, the very girl in whose honor that legendary ball was held, was suffocating in this atmosphere of idleness. She escaped. Not physically, but spiritually. She found her salvation in the world of art, becoming a sculptor and a patron. She rejected money as a goal and turned it into a tool, founding the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She traded the Gilded Cage for bohemian freedom. Her brother, Reginald, chose a different path of escape. He plunged into the very idleness his sister had fled. A playboy, a gambler, a spendthrift, he burned through his inherited fortune in a whirlwind of parties and horse races. He sought oblivion at the bottom of a glass and died of alcoholism at 45, leaving behind only massive debts and a young daughter, the future-style icon Gloria Vanderbilt. The Breakers was built to be the cradle of a mighty dynasty that would rule America for centuries. But something went wrong. Stone and platinum proved to be poor teachers. The house that was meant to instill a sense of duty and responsibility instead bred either rebellion or self-destruction. It was the perfect backdrop for power, but proved incapable of teaching the children how to wield that power. The walls, built to protect the dynasty, began to suffocate it. 4 summer seasons. Only 4 short summers did Cornelius Vanderbilt II live in his stone masterpiece. In 1899, at his New York residence, his heart, weakened by the stroke, stopped. The creator was gone. And in that same instant, the breakers, this thunderous hymn to triumph and life, began to transform into a mausoleum. The master's death was the stone that started an avalanche. It set off a chain reaction of decline, fatal and relentless. The house, built as a guarantee of eternity, became a witness to how fleeting human destiny is. The heir was the first to fall. The eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt II, upon whom all hopes were placed, died in a car crash at the age of just 22. The new century brought with it new speeds, and one of those machines, a symbol of progress, killed the future of the dynasty. Then came the war. In 1915, another son, Alfred, was aboard the passenger liner Lusitania, torpedoed by a German submarine. In the chaos and panic of the sinking ship, he showed true aristocratic composure. He gave his life jacket to a woman with a child and helped others escape until the very end. His body was never found. He died a hero, but for the dynasty, it was another devastating blow. The mansion stood, indestructible, majestic, indifferent to the tragedies unfolding within its walls. It was designed to withstand fire and time, and it performed its task flawlessly. But the people for whom it was built proved to be far more fragile. The dynasty that this palace was meant to immortalize in stone began to crumble, like a sandcastle against the waves. Each new year brought another funeral. Every blow of fate highlighted the terrible irony. The Vanderbilts had built a house that proved more durable than they were. The monument outlived the people. Stone defeated blood. And in its emptying halls, the main question echoed: for whom was all this built, if those who were meant to rule here were departing, one by one? The era was ending. The Gilded Age, with its robber barons and ostentatious luxury, was melting away like an iceberg in the warm waters of a new century. America was changing. Income taxes were introduced, and then inheritance taxes. These laws were an invisible weapon that did what neither competitors nor strikes could do. They brought the titans to their knees. Maintaining palaces like the breakers became economic suicide. The annual expenses were comparable to the budget of a small city. One by one, the giant cottages of Newport began to go dark. They were sold for a pittance, remodeled, or more often, simply demolished to free up the expensive land. Bulldozers crushed marble and crystal, wiping an entire civilization off the face of the earth. But the breakers survived. Why? Paradoxically, it was saved by its own transcendent grandeur. It was too enormous, too expensive, too significant to be destroyed. To demolish it would have been an act of vandalism, comparable to destroying a cathedral. The last mistress from the family, Countess Gladys Szechenyi, Cornelius's youngest daughter, faced an impossible choice: allow the house to slowly fall into ruin, or do the unthinkable, give it away. In 1948, she made her decision. She leased the breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County. The price of the deal was symbolic: $1 a year. And in 1972, the society bought the house from the heirs for $365,000, a sum that would have seemed like a laughable accounting error to Cornelius II. the impregnable private fortress, built to shut itself off from the world, survived only because it opened its doors to that very world. Today, it's not the heirs of an empire who glide through its halls, but tourists in shorts and sneakers. They take selfies against the platinum walls, unaware that this metal was once more expensive than gold. They admire the beauty, oblivious to the cruelty of the capital that created it. The Breakers is the testament of a titan, a testament that proved more enduring than his railroad empire, more enduring than his bloodline, and even more enduring than his name. He wanted to build a symbol of one family's unshakable power. Instead, he built a public history lesson. And in this irony lies its true, unintentional greatness. The stone outlived the man and his ambitions to tell us a story not of how a dynasty was built, but of how all illusions of eternity crumble. This house was conceived as a weapon against time, an indestructible citadel where the Vanderbilt Dynasty was meant to live forever. But the stone, meant to protect the bloodline, ultimately became just a silent witness to its decline, transforming from a symbol of absolute power into a monument to human illusion. So what, in the end, is more enduring, an empire carved in marble, or the scars it leaves on the world? And what are we truly building when we try to defeat our own mortality? The story of this house, like any great story, doesn't end with the final credits. It continues in our dialogue. Share your thoughts in the comments, because that is how stone ceases to be just stone and becomes a lesson. And if you appreciate stories that make you think, support our channel with a like and a subscription.